What if the most famous fairy tale heroine never needed rescuing at all? Today we're exploring how Cinderella evolved from an obedient moral lesson into a symbol of agency, reflecting centuries of changing ideas about what women should be. The Cinderella story we know today emerged from two main sources: Charles Perrault's 1697 French version and the Brothers Grimm's 1812 German telling. Perrault emphasized sweetness and forgiveness, rewarding his heroine's patience with magical intervention and a prince. The Grimm version was darker, featuring mutilation and violence, but both versions carried the same message: endure suffering gracefully, and goodness will be rewarded. These weren't stories about people, but parables about virtue. Cinderella herself barely existed as a character. She was a vessel for teaching girls to be gentle, obedient, and above all, waiting. Her worth came not from action, but from moral purity and beauty that would eventually be recognized. The fairy godmother did the work. The prince made the choice. Cinderella simply existed beautifully in her suffering. When Disney adapted Cinderella in 1950, America was recovering from World War II and desperately seeking comfort in traditional values. The studio was also recovering financially, needing a hit after years of struggle. They found both by creating the ultimate princess, a young woman who scrubbed floors with a smile, sang to mice, and never questioned her circumstances until magic literally appeared to save her. This Cinderella wasn't passive by accident. She embodied the post-war feminine ideal of cheerful domesticity and patient optimism. Her goodness was performed through housework. Her dreams extended only to one night of glamour and finding love. The film suggested that maintaining grace under mistreatment was itself a virtue worthy of reward, and that reward would come from external rescue, not personal action. Disney's version became so culturally dominant that it essentially erased the earlier tales, creating what we now think of as the definitive Cinderella. The glass slipper, the pumpkin carriage, the bibbidi-bobbidi-boo magic became synonymous with the fairy tale itself, cementing a vision of femininity that would take decades to challenge. By 1998, the culture had shifted dramatically. Ever After arrived in an era of third-wave feminism, presenting a Cinderella who didn't need magic because she had agency. Danielle is educated, outspoken, and quotes Thomas More to the prince before he even knows her real identity. She saves herself from the villain, negotiates for a servant's freedom, and challenges royal authority. The film's genius lies in removing magic entirely while keeping the fairy tale structure. Da Vinci replaces the fairy godmother as a mentor who provides tools, not transformation. The glass slipper becomes a practical joke about vanity. The ball becomes a place where Danielle's intelligence, not her beauty, captivates the prince. This version argues that the real magic was never external. It was always Danielle's courage, wit, and compassion. She wins not by enduring, but by acting, thinking, and refusing to accept injustice. The stepmother still exists as an obstacle, but Danielle defeats her through cleverness and strength rather than waiting for rescue. Ever After essentially deconstructed the Cinderella myth to ask what kind of woman she'd need to be if the story actually happened, and the answer was someone far more interesting than passive virtue could create. Disney's 2015 live-action Cinderella represented something fascinating: the studio attempting to reclaim their princess while acknowledging decades of criticism. Director Kenneth Branagh and writer Chris Weitz kept the magic, the fairy godmother, the transformation, but fundamentally reframed what those elements meant. This Cinderella's defining trait becomes have courage and be kind, her mother's dying words that transform kindness from weakness into active choice. Every act of grace becomes deliberate resistance against cruelty. When Ella refuses to retaliate against her stepfamily, it's framed not as passivity but as strength of character. When she meets the prince in the woods, she challenges him about the kingdom's policies. When she runs from the ball, it's her choice based on her values, not panic. The film even adds a scene where the prince searches for her and she has the option to reveal herself but chooses not to, briefly because she doubts he could love her as she truly is. It's a small addition that gives her agency in their reunion. This version argues that the original story wasn't wrong about kindness mattering, but wrong about kindness being passive. The 2015 Cinderella is kind despite having every reason not to be, and that despite is everything. She maintains her humanity in dehumanizing circumstances, which the film presents as the real magic, the real strength. The fairy godmother simply provides the opportunity for Ella's inner goodness to be visible to others. These 4 versions tell us less about Cinderella than about ourselves. Perrault's tale taught girls to be patient in a world where they had no legal rights. Disney's 1950 animation comforted a generation rebuilding traditional family structures. Ever After challenged millennials to imagine heroines who save themselves. The 2015 version tried to split the difference, validating both agency and emotional strength as equally valuable. What makes Cinderella endure isn't the glass slipper or the prince, it's the gap between suffering and happiness, between invisible and seen. Every era pours its anxieties and aspirations about womanhood into that gap. We keep retelling this story because we keep needing to answer the same questions. What makes a woman good? What makes her worthy? And who gets to decide? The evolution from Perrault to Disney to Ever After to Brana tracks a slow cultural shift from obedience as virtue to agency as virtue to finally, perhaps, the understanding that both kindness and courage can coexist. Cinderella herself barely speaks in most versions, but the stories we tell about her never stop talking. They reveal what each generation fears women are, hopes women will be, and struggles to let women become. So maybe Cinderella never needed rescuing from her stepfamily, just from stories that couldn't imagine her as fully human. The real transformation wasn't rags to riches, but from lesson to person, from symbol to self. This is Ladies First, watching women in movies. Here, we empower women by reviewing and discussing films that highlight their stories, struggles, and achievements. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments.